Hello everyone, how are you? Today I'll walk you through my process of making this spooky vending machine in honor of October, the spooky month. I actually started by following this tutorial by Lacruso, so make sure you watch his video. I will show you how to use a tutorial as a basis to make something original, how my concept process was, and what tricks and techniques I used for some objects that were not in the original tutorial. I made this object using 3D modeling techniques, then I added details using grease pencil, and I also made some grease pencil objects come alive using 2D animation techniques. Remember, you can buy the blind file to get a deeper look at this project. You'll get two files, one with the final animation and the other one with a turnaround camera and with a still camera. If you'd like to see a full process video, let me know in the comments. The moment I knew I wanted to make a spooky vending machine, I started thinking about the concept and what elements will give that vibe. I started thinking about the bigger elements, in this case the overall shape of the machine. If you look at both of these objects, you'll notice they are both stylized, but they have different styles. Take a look at these two houses, for example. Both have stylized, exaggerated features, but one is rounder, softer, colorful, and the other one is sharper, irregular, and darker. And that's what I was aiming for. Looking for objects that have a similar silhouette or style is also helpful, especially when you can't find too many references for what you are aiming at. Since there were no concepts of spooky vending machines, I took inspiration from these objects' lines. They are irregular and sharp. So after making the basis shape following the tutorial, I needed to turn it into a sharper, irregular shape. For that, I added a loop cut and moved the edges in edit mode to make an asymmetrical shape. I added a bevel modifier and I kept playing with the edges. I also moved some points individually until I was happy with the result. For the legs, I started with a cylinder and extruding and rotating the faces, I made an irregular kind of shape. After finishing it up, I also added a bevel modifier for the leg and duplicated it. I added a few more loop cuts to the vending machine and moved some vertices to make it look even more irregular. I also changed the back of the object, but I'll explain that later in the video. For making the tray and the pickup box, I used the insert tool and the extrude tool. Back to my concept and planning stage. After deciding on the type of form, I started asking myself, what kind of details will accentuate my spooky concept? So I looked for spooky art to get inspiration, and I thought a monster mouth would look good as the pickup box. To give the idea of an open mouth, I made the pickup box uneven by moving the vertices. For the shelves, I also made irregular forms by adding loop cuts and moving them to make it look like a broken, messy machine to add up to this idea of a creepy object. The button and the tags are also irregular, and just like with the previous objects, I achieved that by moving the vertices and adding a loop cut and moving it. Then I modeled the goods, which are really simple in their shape. For the can, I started with a cylinder and I added a loop cut and scaled it. I extruded the top edges and did the same for the bottom. Then I added a bevel modifier. For the milk carton, I started with a cube and extruded two edges on top. I scaled them on the x-axis and filled those two edges and extruded them. Then I used the bevel tool for the bottom, and I extruded the top edges just a tiny bit. For the bottle, I also started with a cube and I extruded and scaled the top edges. Then I added some loop cuts and scaled them to give the bottle a rounder look. I added a subdivision modifier on top of the bevel modifier. And I beveled the edges. For the cookie box, I started with a cube and scaled the top face on the y-axis. I extruded it and scaled it. I insert a face on each side and extruded again. And I extruded the top as well. For the instant soup, I started with a cylinder, added a loop cut and extruded it. And I did the same for the top. I extruded and released the top and scaled it. Then I checked the normals, which were fine, but decided to move the top faces on the z-axis a bit. And for the lid, I extruded two edges, dissolved the edge in the middle, used the bevel tool and changed it to vertices. And finally, for the chip bags, I added a plane but merged it to the center, and in edit mode, I used the extrusion tool until I got a similar shape to a bag. I extruded all those vertices on the y-axis, added a loop cut in the middle and moved the edges and vertices a bit. I extruded the top and the bottom faces. Then I made some linked duplicates instead of original duplicates, since I didn't want to add any extra geometry. And if I decided to edit the shape, it will change all my duplicates since they were linked. And I made linked duplicates for all the other objects. Back to my monster mouth, using these images as a vague reference, I modeled the teeth using the sculpt tools. I used mostly the grab brush to get the overall shape, the clay brush to smooth the shape a bit, and with the snake hook brush I twisted the mesh to make it look like fangs. I played with the shape and the size of the teeth. For that, I made some original duplicates and changed their shape in a sculpt mode. And I also made some linked duplicates and just changed the size and placement of those objects to add some variety. And I made the mouth a bit bigger to give it emphasis. After that, I thought it would be a good idea to add some spikes at the back, so I changed the back of the machine by moving the vertices to give it an irregular shape, and then I duplicated a tooth and placed it at the back to make the spikes. Another object I thought about adding was a pipe. This is not a spooky element per se, but the line between spooky and disgusting is sometimes a bit blurry. For making the pipe, I started with a cylinder and I added 2 loop cuts and extruded them. I added a curve, and then I added an array modifier and a curved modifier. By editing the curve, I gave a curved shape to the pipe. To give it a better look, I added a subdivision and a solidify modifier. For the wooden base, I started with a cube and added several loop cuts for the blanks. I beveled and extruded those new edges. And to make some irregular planks, I added more loop cuts and moved some edges. I also used the extrusion tool to make the planks even more uneven. And I used the bevel tool as well. The C shortcut is useful to prevent your beveled edges from overlapping. And to make the chipped wood, I used the knife tool and made a triangle. I deleted those faces and then I filled those edges. I also moved the back faces so they didn't look too perfect in comparison to the front. I used the knife tool on the planks that were at the sides and moved those edges to the inside to make the shape more irregular. For the lighting, I did the same as the tutorial. I placed a sun lamp and rotated until I got the shadows on one side. For the materials, again, I followed the tutorial, so I used a principled BSDF, a shader to RGB, and the color ramp node in all of my objects, but the vending machine. For the vending machine, I used several materials. For most of the vending machine, I used this material, which is the same type of material as the tutorial. Then I added some loop cuts and assigned this material to some faces to achieve these lines at the side. I assigned a similar material but with a different value for the noise texture node to the inside of the tray. And finally, I assigned this completely dark material to some areas where I didn't want any light, like this area right here, because the drone eyes looked better with a dark background, and then the inside of the mouth. You might be asking how I chose my color scheme. First, I knew I wanted dark colors, and I picked purple for most of the scene, and then I chose its opposite color, which is green. For the rest of the objects, I wanted to keep the color palette as limited as possible, so I chose cool tones that were closer to purple, since it was the dominant color. For the line art modifier, I decided to make something different from the original tutorial. In the tutorial, only one line art modifier was used, but I decided to move the objects with the same color to the same collection and add several line art modifiers, so each group of objects will have a different outline color. So for the blue objects, I chose a dark blue material. Then I chose a dark purple for the purple objects, and so on. I also chose different line thickness settings, since some objects are smaller than others, and the same line thickness value will look too thin or too thick in some of them. Then I decided to add some lines, and for that I used the same materials as the line art modifiers, and in a new responsive object I set my stroke placement to surface, and I drew some lines in the vending machine. I also added some lines to the goods, so they didn't look too plain. While in the concept stage, I thought, what kind of logos will add up to the feeling I was going for? So I decided to draw a school, a radioactive logo, a SPIDERWEB, some blood and fangs, a ghost, a pentagram, and an eye and some scales. I made use of the edit and the sculpt tools to perfect some of the shapes, and I also duplicated the logos in edit mode, so I didn't have to draw them several times. And finally, I had to make sure the strokes weren't too far away from the objects. For the wooden base, I drew some lines and spirals. And since the strokes looked a bit too light, I used the thickness brush in a sculpt mode with pressure sensitivity enabled to achieve a more imperfect look. To finish up, I placed the strokes that were at the top a bit closer to the 3D model. And then I deleted some points that stuck out. Back to my planning stage, since the original vending machine had some stickers, I decided to add some to mine, but of course they had to be into the spooky theme. So I decided to look for some pop culture references that had something to do with either Halloween or a horror film, and I decided to go with the Real Monsters sticker, which was a 90s Nickelodeon show. For the Real Monsters sticker, I opened a poster in an image editor, erased the background and imported that image as a plane. To do that, I enabled the Import Images as Planes add-on, just because it makes the importing process quicker by making a new image texture material and by setting up the blend mode and the shadow mode to alpha blend and alpha clip so the image has a transparent background. I didn't want my sticker to be affected by light, so I changed the principal BSDF node to a transparent BSDF node and added a mixed shader node. If you're using an older version of Blender, you might not find the mixed shader node, but you can use the mixed RGB node. I used a shrink wrap modifier and a subdivision modifier so the sticker will get pasted perfectly onto the vending machine. For the bloody handprint, the setup for the material was the same, but I added a hue saturation value node because the image looked a bit too saturated for my taste. In case you're wondering how to get an image like this one, you can go to FreePic, where you'll find lots of free and premium resources. I had to open the file in an image editor to erase the white background, and then I added the image as a plane in Blender. And for the cry for help, I added a grease pencil object and I enabled use pressure since I was using a graphic tablet and I wanted the letters to look a bit rougher and less perfect. Another element I decided to add was a SPIDERWEB. My stroke placement is set to 3D cursor. Then I changed the material into a yellowish white and I changed the opacity of that layer. In another layer, I drew the saliva for the mouth. And I chose a light turquoise color. Since the strokes seemed a bit too light, I added some thickness in a sculpt mode. Then I changed the opacity of that layer. Up to this point, all my elements were still, so I thought, What animated objects could I add to make this object come alive? First, I thought about adding some spooky eyes, like the ones you'd see in older animated films, and I found this GIF as a reference. This one is a pretty simple animation, it's just a blink, but what if you wanted to decompose a GIF to see the animation frame by frame and understand how the animation was made? You can use a website such as itsetgif.com, select the GIF or the URL, and now you can see all the frames and even download them as a RAR file, and see them on your computer and go frame by frame using the picture viewer. I enabled auto keying, and in a new grease pencil object using a yellow material fill color, I drew an open eye in frame 3. My stroke placement is set to 3D cursor, and to get your strokes drawn in the exact planes you want to, you can select an object, go to edit mode, select a vertex that is where you want your strokes to get drawn at, press Shift S and choose cursor to selected. Then in edit mode, I rotate the eye 180 degrees to get the other one without drawing again. Changed the shape a bit in sculpt mode, and in the previous frame with onion skin enabled, I drew the eye again, but this time a bit smaller. It doesn't look bad, but I wanted a smoother animation, so I moved the last keyframe, and in frame 3 I drew an in-between. I added a glow effect, I spaced the keyframes a bit, and I copied the keyframes to get a loop animation. So in my final animation I have a blank keyframe, slightly open, a bit wider, and completely open. The same keyframe as this one, and here I left a few frames between the open eyes and the eyes beginning to close again, so the eyes stay open for a while, and then the eyes close again. To make the second pair of eyes, I duplicated the layer, and with multi-framed enabled, all my frames from only that layer selected, and all the strokes from that layer selected, I moved all those strokes. To select all the strokes, you can simply lock the other layer and press A to select all. Then I moved the keyframes of this new layer so the second eyes will blink at a different time. And I added a time offset modifier so the animation goes on forever. Then, since I had a drain modeled already, I chose to add some polluted water coming out of the drain. First, I drew a line to sketch the movement the water will make. Then I sketched the line on top. I perfected the lines in a sculpt mode, and I duplicated the frames to get a loop animation. I placed the strokes with multi-frame enabled. In a new layer, using a brown fill material, I painted inside the sketch lines. Lowering the opacity of the layer was helpful to see the sketch lines. Once I had all my layers filled, I perfected the strokes a bit in a sculpt mode. And I duplicated the keyframes to create a loop just like I did with the sketch lines. I enabled randomized radios since I was using a graphic tablet, and I drew some lines to make some animated highlights. And again, I duplicated the keyframes to make the loop. I added a noise modifier to the highlights layer only. And now with all the elements I had already, my animation was lagging. You can see here that it wasn't playing at 24 frames per second, which is the frame rate I had chosen. But what you could do to visualize your animation correctly is, first, make sure you're not overwriting any file. I usually choose the temporary folder, but you could choose any other folder in case you wanted to keep the files we are about to render. Then go to View, Viewport Render Animation. And after the frames get rendered, go to Render, View Animation. This was too fast, obviously, so I spaced the keyframes and I hit the sketch layer before rendering. And now it's looking better. Then I added an offset modifier. Then I decided to add some nasty slime coming out of the vending machine. With randomize disabled, I sketched the slime going down. Looking for sprite sheets is really useful to get an idea on how to animate something frame by frame.
Two hours later.
Let's see the animation. Then, using a green fill material, it was time to paint the sketch. After filling every frame, let's see how it looks. I moved all the keyframes and added a blank keyframe in frame 1, so I was able to make a loop animation. Then I added some shadows using a darker green with the mask enabled to prevent painting outside the field. I also added some lines, and after that I added a lighter color for the highlights. I added a blank keyframe at the end. Let's see a preview. And here's another tip. If you're in a sculpt mode trying to edit the shape of a stroke and you only want one specific stroke to get affected by the brush, you can click here, select the stroke, and now use the sculpt tool of your choice. And if you click this little arrow, you'll get other select tools. Then I decided to animate the entire vending machine like there's a monster inside of it or like the machine has come alive. For that, I added an empty, and first I hid all the objects I didn't want to get animated, such as the camera and the light, the floor, and I had to separate these strokes for the wooded base to a new grease pencil object, so I could hide only these strokes. Then I parent all my visible objects to the empty. So now if I move the empty, everything else will move. And then I just had to animate that empty to the sides. First I made a location and rotation keyframe right where it was. Then in another frame I moved the empty up and to the side. And then I animated the empty to the other side. Then I duplicated the second keyframe to create a bouncy effect. And then I duplicated the first keyframe to the end and also to frame 1. In the graph editor, I added a cycles modifier to make the animation loop. And inspired by films such as The Mitchells vs. the Machines and the new Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, I added some 2D doodles to accentuate the animation. So in the frame the machine leans to the side, I drew some lightning bolts. Then I changed the stroke placement to stroke, so the new drawings get drawn exactly where the other ones were. And I drew smaller lightning bolts in the previous frame. And in the last frame, I drew them a bit bigger. After that one, I added a blank keyframe. And here it is. For the next doodle, I changed the gapped type to flat and decided to just draw a few lines that moved to the corner. Later, I drew some lines and some stars. Then I added a time offset modifier. And since my 2D doodles were covered by the 3D objects, all I had to do was make the object display in front of others by enabling this box here. For the background, I did the same as the tutorial to separate the color and the lighting in the word color. But I didn't want a plain color, so I added a color ramp, a gradient texture, a texture coordinate, and a mapping node to get a spherical gradient background. You could add a wave texture node instead and get a striped background, for example, or any kind of shape you like depending on the type of node you add. And here we have the final animation. If you have come this far, let me know in the comments what you think about this animation, what kind of videos you'd like to see next, and if you'd like to see a full process video. Remember, you can buy the blend file to get a deeper look at this project. You'll get 2 files, one with the final animation and the other one with a turnaround camera and with a still camera. As always, thanks for watching and see you in the next one. Bye!